Now we're going to turn and talk a little bit about the Roman Missal. Through the first 15 centuries, there was no Roman Missal. There were books of prayers, there were books of chants, there were books of rites, there were certainly the scriptures. There were also a number of sacramentaries that were used throughout the church. In Venice in 1474, all of these were pulled together, edited, and offered to the entire church as a complete Roman Missal. Usage was not mandatory. 100 years later, through the workings of the Council of Trent, Pope Pius V issued the first mandatory Roman Missal. This Trinitine Missal was used for the next 400 years. An interesting aside is that at the Council of Trent, the bishops talked about putting the Roman Missal into the vernacular, but they decided that they would keep it in Latin because they didn't want to look too Protestant. Remember, the Council of Trent was called in response to the Protestant revolt. Various popes along the way have made changes to the Trinitine Roman Missal. There were additions of prayers and prefaces for newly canonized saints. In the 1950s, after the Church declared the doctrine of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Pope Pius XII added a lot of material to include that feast day. Then came Vatican II. Let us take a look at the effects of Vatican II. In 1963, the Council issued the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, and it said in part, and I quote, "In order that the Christian people may more clearly derive an abundance of graces from the sacred liturgy, the Christian people should be enabled to understand the liturgy with ease and to take part in the liturgy fully and actively." Because of this, Father no longer said Mass, and we no longer just attended Mass. Now we participate in the celebration with the presider. Worldwide, we understand the liturgy in our own language. The Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy was issued in December 1963. By January 1965, a mere 13 months later, the Order of the Mass, post-Vatican II, was issued in Latin. Latin, the language of our Roman Catholic Church. The Order of the Mass is the unchanging parts of the Mass, spoken by the presider and spoken by the people. The Order of the Mass does not include the parts that change daily or by season, such as the prefaces and some of the prayers. 1 year after the Order of the Mass was issued in Latin, it was translated into English. And in 1966, the altar was turned around to face the congregation. The priest began to celebrate Mass in the English language, and we participated and responded in English. In 1969, a new Order of the Mass, more thoroughly developed and with a more scholarly effort, was completed in Latin. 1 year later, it became available in English. By 1974, all the other prayers were translated into English, and we had the first edition, post-Vatican II, of the Roman Missal. We continued to use this first edition through 1985. In that year, the second edition became available in English. This is the edition of the Roman Missal we use today. The red sacramentary that sits on the altar at every Mass is, in effect, the second edition of the Roman Missal. The first and second editions of the Roman Missal, from 1969 through 1985, used a translation approach called dynamic equivalence. I'll talk a little more about dynamic equivalence later. The third edition of the Roman Missal was completed in Latin in 2002. The approval of the English translation occurred in March of 2010. We will begin using this newest version on the first Sunday of Advent, 2011. And in preparation for this, we are focused at Our Lady of the Lake Parish on our Year of the Mass. The need for the third edition was to add prayers and prefaces for new saints, to incorporate the 2002 general instructions on the Roman Missal, and to include other rite books that have developed over the last 30 years. Now, let's take a brief look at how our Roman Catholic Church translates books from Latin into English.